Welcome to the thing where we're going to talk about grief.
Yeah!
And crying.
Explosion!
Grief explosion.
Woo!
Welcome to our grief explosion.
Yeah.
Brett and Davo's grief explosion show. Welcome back to Yes, I'm Adopted. Don't make it weird again. Once more, you're here for episode 11 of season 2 of this thing that we do regularly. I'm still Davo, and you're still...
I am still Brett.
Still Brett.
It's still happening, baby.
And this week, we're going to continue part 2, our discussion about how we deal with trauma and grief.
Is that why you started out the episode so peppy? Is because it's going to get like real
It's gonna
down
be
here in a
sad.
second?
Yeah, it's not going to be... It's not going to be...
Yeah, let's go!
Welcome to the thing where we're going to...
Woo!
Oh, I almost used radio voice for a second there.
So to continue the conversation from last week, we were talking about the effects of trauma versus grief, the vernacular that we use around here, so that way it doesn't get confusing when you guys are watching. So if you are watching this episode but you haven't seen part 1 yet, go check it out right now. It's in the description above right now, or if you're watching on YouTube, it's in the description below. Because different formats have different things. You look every time.
You say that, but
You
I
look
haven't
every time.
seen.
Go watch that video, let us know what you guys think, and then get ready for this week because we are talking about how we deal with our trauma and grief. Buckle up, Buttercup. Just like last week's, we're probably going to go a little bit long on today's, so just be prepared for that. But a lot of you didn't seem to mind, so hey, thanks for joining us. We describe trauma as the physical manifestation of something happening in your life. You know, the way that your brain now is wired, or the grooves, or how your brain functions. There was a trauma that took place, and especially in our case, with the infant trauma being nonverbal and having to deal with that. Now, as we got older, we had to... I don't know, there were a lot of things that came up because of it. You know, I talked about the clinginess for me. He talked about pushing people away so that way they couldn't judge him. And that's kind of how it manifested in our lives. So for you, David, let's start with that. How did you get past that? Because you could still push people away. And you could still not make these connections so they don't judge you. But that's a bad thing to do.
Sure.
So how did you, in your life, and I guess at what age did you start realizing that it wasn't healthy and that you wanted to make a change?
When we talk about how we dealt and when, I think for me, none of this research was available when we were kids, right? So during like
We're pioneers.
The vast majority of our dealing with the effects of trauma, we didn't know what those things were. We didn't know that they were the effects of something.
Right,
It was
exactly.
just like, why can't I have like a normal conversation about my relationships?
Right.
Or, like,
why can't I just talk to people without getting upset for no reason whatsoever?
Right. And all that kind of stuff. And I think it probably wasn't until my mid-late 20s that I realized just how detrimental that was to my relationships, because it had just kind of always been how things were. And then it wasn't until, honestly, late 20s, early 30s that I was like, oh, I can actually do something about this. This doesn't have to be the way that I function. This doesn't have to be the way that my brain works and does stuff. And that, honestly, it largely has to do more with, I think, just being aware of what has actually happened.
Yeah.
Than it has to do with
Facing it head on.
Yeah, just knowing, with the trauma especially, it's knowing that something occurred in my brain that I didn't have any control over, and that it's possible to change those neural connections to be something healthier, to be something better. So the concept of, for instance, neuroplasticity was nothing that we knew about until, I don't know, a few years ago.
Right, that's when they really started digging into it, realizing, hey, the brain does shift whenever they do certain things.
Mm-hmm.
Who'd have thunk?
And, I think, with most problems, the first thing for me was to say, this is an issue that I need to probably figure out if there's something I can do with.
Which is always like a really difficult step. That first step of coming to the realization that, oh man, I should probably fix me. Oh.
Turns out I'm not perfect.
I mean, you're not.
You're a treasure. The first steps as far as dealing with what these things are is really just knowing that they're there.
Yeah.
And then it's saying, okay, specifically with trauma, that there's been a physical impact to your brain, and that you can, through thinking and metacognition, actually change
In time and practice.
change the way that your brain works and is wired. You can change the physical structure of the brain in order to deal with the trauma.
Yep.
Right, and that's really cool. So, and there's a lot of resources that we'll talk about at some point that
Right.
are available for that. The corny side of most of that,
Let's get corny.
right, is that honestly, what we did or what I did was read a lot of self-help books and not tell anybody about it, because when they see you reading all the self-help books,
Yep. You become that guy.
if you had
and there's no going back.
If you had a fear of being judged, that fear is totally founded when you're walking around reading a bunch of self-help books.
Yep.
So, there you go.
Yeah. So you became that guy. But
Yeah.
it helped.
It did help.
It did help.
It's been tremendous. Yeah.
Like,
we learned
you
a lot.
know, yeah. Go read some self-help books.
I can recommend a few.
Me, on the other hand, I am not as big of a reader as Davo. He'll read something like 100 books in a year. I'll read like half of a book.
Half of one.
Half of one. I read a whole book last year.
You did. You
I
did read a book last
I did
year.
read a book.
Congratulations.
Get off my case. I'm too busy making content like this for the people.
It's true. That's legitimately true. Brett does all of the work.
All of the
I
work.
show up here and I say words and then I go back in my office.
Man, you're lucky you were adopted. That way you could work with me.
What can I say?
Right.
You're a treasure.
So for me, the trauma manifested as clinginess and having a really difficult time with relationships, to be quite honest. I had one girlfriend in my life, and this is not like, oh, woe is me, only had one girlfriend. I married that girl, so I win. I always had a hard time wanting to pursue these relationships, and especially with girls, because I was so afraid that they were always judging me. Like, in high school, I became the best friend to most of the girls, it seemed like, in high school. And I had, like, I think 2 guy friends, and I wasn't even that close with them. I was really close with these girls because they were so open and willing to accept me. And that was a big part. Like, guys, and especially in high school, we're always picking on each other. We're always, just poking fun at each other. Even if you're, like, the best of friends, it doesn't matter. You're always poking fun at each other.
Or in your 30s on your
Or in your 30s.
on your show.
On camera. To the second camera. It's great. And so I always had a hard time wanting to actually put any effort into these relationships. And so once I did, though, and my wife and I started dating, I got super clingy. Like you are not allowed to leave my sight for more than 30 seconds. Otherwise, I'm going to think that you died or you found something better. It was bad, dude. Like, we would sit on the phone, and this is before cell phones. This is before, like, the internet gave us the ability to communicate with each other. We were sitting on landlines for 2 hours to 3 hours every night, sometimes sitting there in silence, but I needed to know that she was still there, and that's it.
Sense of permanence?
Yeah. I had such a hard time being separated. Because that was like one of the only relationships that I really, I guess, wanted to hold on to. And it sounds really bad, and especially if you're like a friend of mine from a long time ago, it sounds horrible, right? But that was like the first relationship that I was like, I can't screw this up. But in not wanting to screw it up, I started screwing it up. Because I got real clingy. And she had to sit me down many times and be like, dude, stop. You hear that? Stop. And so we had to have these conversations, sometimes multiple times a day for me to just let go a little bit more. How I dealt with that is having her yell at me a lot. She's gonna watch this episode.
This is like the worst advice.
No, I'm joking.
if you have an adopted child that
Yeah.
has clinginess issues, just yell,
Yell at them a lot.
Just
It's
a lot of
great.
yelling.
Ah, what is wrong with you? No.
Get him a girlfriend and then let them yell.
But honestly, though, for me, it was, a lot of those conversations. Just, okay, why do I feel like I need to cling to you? Why do I feel like I can't leave your side or you can't leave my sight for more than 30 seconds? And opening up that dialogue really started showing me a lot about who I am as a person. And it helped me deal with that to the point where I didn't scare her away.
Mm.
And that was fantastic for me because I was so worried that I was going to scare her away. For a long time, I had this fear that I'm going to scare her away, but I can't stop being clingy. And so I'm fighting myself in my head. It hasn't been until the last couple of years when we really started talking about this stuff that I kind of paired it to adoption pre-verbal trauma.
Sure.
And saying that a lot of this stuff is because I wasn't able to verbalize as a baby, being taken away from my birth mother, being passed to different families and orphanages and foster, to finally going to another family that was at least a 24-hour trip to get to, and an airplane, which is scary in itself. And I didn't know how to deal with that. And so it has manifested in my brain to cling to people as soon as I can, or be afraid of building those relationships because of the fear that one day we will separate.
So besides the yelling, what else has been helpful?
No, again, it was those conversations, right? It wasn't yelling. I love you, wife. She didn't yell at me. Well, she didn't always yell at me.
I'm sure there was some yelling. I mean, we're a little bit difficult to be around.
We are. We're very difficult people to be around.
My relationship with my wife in the early years was much more difficult,
Right.
Because there was all of this stuff that we hadn't even begun.
I haven't even dealt with.
Yeah, and so now we have.
Mhm.
So when it comes to the trauma, I honestly think very clinically.
Yeah.
I think about brain science, and I think about how
Right.
we can change things. Now, when it comes to grief, what to you signifies the difference between how you've dealt with trauma and how you've dealt with grief, or what was the grief manifestation versus the trauma manifestation? Or can you see a difference?
So the grief manifestation for me, little backstory, and I've talked a little bit about this, but I was super sick and I had chronic migraines and would have to sit in my room for months at a time in darkness.
Mm-hmm.
During that time, you have a lot of really weird thoughts, and you get to know yourself really well, and what you find is not always pretty. And that's when really the grief started manifesting for me, was this thought process of, I'm alone. Okay, why am I alone? Okay, why was I given up to be alone? Who is this family? Who is this birth mother? And all this other stuff. And that really took me down this dark path that, honestly, I was not prepared for. I don't think anybody's really prepared to deal with that kind of thought process.
Right.
But having to be by myself, I had to face that head on. Because it was either face it head on or let it tear me to pieces. Like I said, it wasn't pretty. Having to go through that, having to think about these thoughts. Because I didn't want to talk to anybody about it. Did you? Did you want to talk to anybody about that grief or the thought, why was I given up at the time?
I compulsively I did with my mom.
Okay.
A little bit, but it wasn't necessarily because I wanted to, right? It was because it just happened.
Okay.
That just spewed out of me at that point. So,
Right.
Grief for me and that loss definitely showed more in like how I saw myself and showed more in my self-worth and that sort of thing, which was interesting because I'm a pretty self-deprecating person, all things considered.
Yeah, me too.
Even to now, but now it's more like because I choose to be versus then it was
Right.
like, oh well, I'm just an awful human.
Yeah,
and nobody wants me.
I only believe that like 90%. It's fine.
Yeah, and and that's how I felt it then, and I very specifically remember having cried a lot as a youth.
I didn't really.
You don't cry though.
I didn't cry.
You're not a crier.
Like, I don't know. Like, for a long time, I thought I was broken. I still kind of think I'm a little broken.
I mean,
shut up. You can't say that. Because I'm not a crier. It never manifested in I'm gonna sit here and tear up about it. I just got angry. I skipped the whole sad step and went right to anger. And just got really frustrated and had all this pent up aggression against somebody I never knew. I'm over it now. So birth mom, if you're watching, don't be afraid. You can contact me.
Like, comment, subscribe, and share.
Send money.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely have been more sad in how I've dealt with things, I think.
Right.
Like, it's just been a lot more grieving in I think, more of a traditional sense is how I've dealt with grief. And that's kind of become more potent, I suppose, and more extreme in the later years with losing my folks, right? So, having lost mom and dad over the last few years here, it's been a lot more like dealing with both of those griefs at the same time. Like, this is a thing that no longer exists, and it could have. Right? So, I mean, even in that vernacular, like, I when I talk about grief and I talk about mourning, right? Like, I've mourned, and that was a pretty sudden thing, right? So when I talk about it, I'm like, okay, well, mourning happens with the loss. Like, we lost, and that sucked.
Yep.
But the grief is processing, when I talk about it anyway, it's processing through the things that now can't be anymore, right? So, like, my parents would have been tremendous grandparents, and I grieve that. That sucks that they're not here because we can't have that now.
Right.
And when I talk about the grief of losing the birth family or whatever, like, there's a whole nother life, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's a whole nother
it's
life.
so weird to think about.
That could have been the life that I lived and is not.
Yep.
And instead I'm living this life, which I'm not unhappy about.
Right.
Right? I really enjoy this life.
But it doesn't stop that
gratified
thought.
in this life. But there's still that part of you that's just like, oh, potentially there's other relatives out there, or potentially there's a whole nother like thing that could have happened.
Yep.
And who would I be then? Right?
Yep.
And here's the shortened version of how I think we've both dealt with grief, which is to say we acknowledge the cognitive dissonance of what could have been as a reality, but we accept that what is.
Yep.
And that's really hard.
It is. It's so difficult to, and especially in the younger years, to accept your current reality as your reality. Because you're always striving for something different. You're always striving for something more. Some people get lost in books. Some people get lost in video games. Some people get lost in Instagram now. But you're wanting to be more. You're wanting to do more. And as an adoptee, you kind of have this thought that if I wasn't adopted and I was still with my birth family, could I have been or done more? And that's something really hard to come to grips with.
Yeah.
Because you're not prepared for that.
There's so many issues there, right? Like, not even just, like, the grief, but there's also, the vast majority of adoptees we know have this desire to not rock the boat, right? Or to please, or to not inconvenience people.
Pleaser.
Or all of these different things. And then you couple that with the fact that, like, we also have these ridiculous ideas of what life potentially also could have been like. But we don't want to bring that up because we also don't want to inconvenience you with the thoughts that we're having. And also we've got this loyalty to this family that we don't want to do that. Which is rough.
It's rough.
But the reality of the situation is that we accept what is.
Yep.
And say that this is who we are, and you get to decide. Are you happy about it or not? Right? And that's who we are, and we're good with that. There comes a point in everybody's life, but especially in adoptees, where we have to just accept that there are things that you just won't know. And that leads to the maturity to be able to move on. So there you go.
Boom.
How long did that take?
Took a while to get there, but we got there. That's it for today's really long episode and ramblings from Brett and Devo. That's us.
Still.
I just had to make it awkward at the end. So thank you guys for joining us. Please make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Tell us your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. We loved being able to have these conversations. The last video that we had like 80-some shares. It's great. Thank you all for sharing it. It's amazing being able to get it out there. So we want to be able to continue that conversation, talk to you guys about how it is that you're dealing with this trauma, or as a parent, how to walk your child through this trauma. So throw it in the comments, send us a private message. We will see you guys on the weekend updates. We have one more episode left in the season.
Just one.
One more episode left in the season.
Then we're going to take a break.
And then we're going to come back. Hopefully.
If you still want to look at our faces. Saying things.
Yeah.
Out of the faces.
Peace out, homie.
Hmm.